Hey, this is Dan Harris. I am a fidgety, skeptical newsman who had a panic attack live on Good Morning America. That led me to something I always thought was ridiculous: meditation. Basically, here's what I'm obsessed with. Can you be an ambitious person and still strive for enlightenment, whatever that means? Okay, my guest this time is one of the most interesting dudes I've ever met. Check out his resume. He is a lawyer, a rabbi, a meditation teacher, a gay rights activist, an author, and a columnist for the Daily Beast. He's Jay Michaelson. Did I miss anything?
That's more than enough.
Really? But you also...
You skipped the professor at theological seminary, but that's fine. Yeah.
It's an impressive list. Now, primarily my interest in you is that you've done a lot of meditation, serious meditation, months of silent retreat, and yet are still, as one can obviously tell from that list of occupations, very engaged in the actual world. So I want to talk a lot about how you can be as serious as meditation as you are, and yet so fully engaged. Also, you're willing to talk about things that are considered pretty taboo in the meditation world. So I want to talk about that as well. But let me start at the beginning, which is, how did you start meditating and why?
Yeah, I think I really, in Buddhist psychology, there are three types of people: greed, fear, and delusion. Mm-hmm. And, I'm really a greed type. I just want every possible experience. I want to have the most wild, sensuous experiences, spiritual experiences. And that's actually what got me into it, which is a little unusual. Most people who get into meditation, are experiencing suffering, right? And they want to have less stress. For me, I just wanted to have awesome experiences, which is a really bad reason to get into meditation. It's sort of a terrible idea.
There's a great quote from your phenomenal book called Evolving Dharma, which I recommend to everybody who's serious about what has been called deep end of the pool meditation. You say, "When I started out in contemplative practice, I was searching for the mountain on the edge of the world, enlightenment, the big joy, mystical union, the whole spiritual enchilada of love, wisdom, happiness, perfection." And what's interesting to me about that is, and you were starting to talk about this, I was interested because I wanted to be 10% happier. I wanted to be less of a schmuck, to myself and others. I wanted to have my monkey mind toned down just a little bit. I didn't even, enlightenment was not in the picture at all. So why did you want this stuff, and why did you even believe enlightenment was real?
Well, I came at it I was an academic before I was a practitioner, right? So, I have this PhD in religion, and I was studying mysticism for a lot of my 20s when I wasn't busy going to law school. So that was really the impetus, was reading about some of these experiences. I was just amazed at the way that so many people expressed these kinds of transcendent experiences in different ways, but with a lot of commonalities. And
why didn't you think they were full of crap? Why didn't you think they're just making
a lot of people? Also, these are the people who are like experts at looking at their own mind over 3,000 years, and they all seem to have these wild experiences, without eating mushrooms, or with eating mushrooms for that matter. But there were all these people who had these sort of transcendent experiences. It just seemed, I don't know, so I did study it for a while with a really skeptical eye, never intending that this would be something that I did. But when the opportunity came along, so it seemed like something worth trying.
Did it work? Did you experience the whole spiritual enchilada?
It actually did work. I wouldn't call it the whole enchilada, maybe a taco. And the way it worked...
A flauta.
Exactly. Right. It's definitely a chalupa, a spiritual chalupa. My first retreat, I did think, okay, great, here I am, 7 days of silence. It was in a kind of a Jewish context. There was like Kabbalah around, which is what I'd focused on in my 20s. And I thought, all right, great, I'm going to have these experiences. What I didn't know, and maybe what you didn't know, is that, we're just all liars. I mean, actually, it's really difficult meditation. And when you go into the deep end and you start looking at, difficult things, and you see what a jerk you really are, and then, I didn't... there's a Buddhist book called Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung, which I think is a great title for a meditation book. Maybe that'll be your next book. You could just call it that.
Can I just steal that?
Just call that. Just do that. He's a monk. He can't own anything anyway, the guy who wrote it. So that's how I felt that first week. But then as the mind quiets down, some of those experiences did actually arise. Again, I wouldn't call it necessarily the whole enchilada, but it was a taste of something deeply profound.
But what are we talking about?
So I think now when I look back on it, it's, I've deepened those experiences quite a lot since the first retreat, tried to get a little more systematic about what's going on and what, how much is delusion and how much is what's really happening. It does seem as though it's possible with concentration, sort of, focusing the mind and cutting down on how much noise is there. You can really have a vivid experience of something very, mundane. So I have a piece in one book where I talk about a string bean. It was the most profound string bean that I ever ate in my life, and it was just an ordinary string bean. So it's not that it's not that you see Lucy in the sky with diamonds. You just kind of imagine, or just kind of experience the wonder of every moment. And it turns out to be just like Aldous Huxley said, quoting William Blake, right? The doors of perception are cleansed and the world appears very different. And I think that just comes from having a concentrated mind. I don't think it's a supernatural phenomenon. I don't think there's angels and, God and things like that getting involved. But the mind can relate to things in a different way. And we know that because we experience it all the time. If you're in the flow state, for example, or if you're having a peak experience, birth of a child, for example, or some momentous experience, everything can be really crisp and really clear. And it's possible to have a similar experience, if not the same, just sitting and watching your breath.
Right. So you're not leaving it to chance. You're actually developing the capacity to have these experiences. And in Evolving Dharma, you talk about how with a concentrated mind, with a mind where discursive thought has come slowed down, watching paint dry can be exciting, even if the paint is already dry.
Yeah, it was great. I was doing walking meditation at Insight Meditation Society, and the way you do it is you walk.
I just want to interrupt you. That is a retreat center in central Massachusetts run by Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg.
Right. And one of the practices, you walk back and forth in a room over and over again, which doesn't sound very exciting,
yes.
But it can actually be profound. When you get to the end, you're meant to just turn around. I got to the end and I was staring at this paint, and there were all these bubbles, and it was beautiful, and it was beige, and it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And again, no drugs involved, just meditation. But, I think the key part to take away from this part of the conversation is, as practice deepens, you realize that these experiences are not the point. It's a little bit kind of a sideshow. And the real point is transformation that's lasting in the mind, not just states of mind, but stages of mind, that it's possible to become 10% happier or 10% more just or 10% more compassionate.
But is it possible to become not just 10% happier, but 100% happy? Is enlightenment real?
Yeah,
and what does it even mean?
Yeah, so I think the last question is the most important. What does it mean? It depends who's asking. So if I take off my Buddhist hat and put on my Jewish hat, I would say, who's asking? What does enlightenment mean? It means different things in different traditions. It's very clear that in some traditions, enlightenment means a theistic experience, so an experience of God, whatever that is. And it is an experience. And it's an experience that's so profound that it, resonates for the rest of one's life. And I think in the Dharma traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., it's less about having that particular experience and more about just suffering less, holding on less, grabbing less. And that's just training the mind. And we can see that in our own practice. I think, it's been a couple of years since you wrote 10% happier. Probably now you're 12% happier.
You know what? I realize I'm going to be stuck with math jokes the rest of my life.
Yep. Well, that was you and your publicist's fault. So I think you just see it in practice that it actually does happen. And then you meet people who seem more advanced, just like in anything else. You can become, 10% more fit, and then you meet some athlete or, some marathon runner, something like that, who's really, really fit. And those are the examples that inspire us. And so I've come across some of those people. Again, they're not necessarily mystical woo-woo people you would immediately spot. They're not wearing necessarily brightly colored robes, but people who really grasp less.
But the Buddha wasn't advertising, incremental improvement. He was talking about, when he talked about enlightenment, although as you point out in your book, he didn't use the word enlightenment. When he talked about awakening and liberation, he talked about the remainderless uprooting of greed, hatred, and delusion. That's the enchilada right there.
Yeah.
And so, do you think that is possible?
Sure.
Have you ever seen anybody?
I've seen people who seem to be very unstuck and who are in difficult situations, and they react just like human beings do, but they are not, as stuck as I get when I'm in a traffic jam. And they're in more such serious situations than that. So I don't think I don't think it's necessarily a all or nothing enchilada or no enchilada approach. And I think, just even in any map, like in the Buddhist map, the Theravada Buddhist map, there's 4 stages of enlightenment. In the Tibetan Buddhist map, there are 12 stages of enlightenment. There are all these stages. The Zen ox herding pictures, which is the stages of enlightenment, have stages along the path. So, in a way, yeah, it's the deep end of the pool, but it's a slope from the shallow end to the deep end. It's not that you just jump right in and you're now at full depth.
So it's like you get a flauta, then you get a plate full of flautas, and
I think this metaphor is getting pretty annoying by now. But if we want to keep going, yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly what you just said.
All right, I'll leave it alone. I'll stop flogging this ox. So Describe to me. So you talked right there about the different maps of enlightenment among the different Buddhist traditions, and there are maps. You can correct me if I'm wrong in the various mystical strains of the Abrahamic faith as well. But I think you and I mostly practice Buddhist meditation, and you talked about the Theravadan map, which is where you've spent most of your time. This is Theravada is one of the schools of Buddhism. It's probably the old school. So it's called in this school the progress or the path of insight. Break it down for us. How does that work?
So, without going in the sort of nitty gritty and getting lost in the weeds, the idea is that in intensive practice, the deep end of the pool, the mind naturally kind of goes through certain cycles. You see this, and then you see that, and you see the other thing. And again, that shouldn't necessarily be surprising or mystically strange. If you're studying math, first you do with arithmetic, and then eventually you'll get to algebra, and then eventually you'll get to calculus. So it's kind of similar, and it's how the mind sees through certain patterns all the time. So, for example, it looks to me and you like, there's a table here, and it's very solid, and it's never going away. Obviously, we know intellectually that's not true. Hopefully sooner rather than later, an interior designer will come in and realize that this table should be replaced, and then the table won't be here. So, but it's possible to really kind of intuitively get that. And that, I think, is the part that I want to emphasize, is that, you can just read The Path of Insight in a book, but it's really more like a cookbook. And you don't taste the dish just by reading the recipes. You actually have to do it. So you do it, the mind eventually develops what are understood as intuitive knowledges. Like it gets it. You really get it. Just like a small child, at a certain point they get it. Don't run into traffic. Or hopefully they get it. Or they get certain things in a basic intuitive level that doesn't require like a lot of thinking about it. And so the notion is that the mind goes through these various stages of insight when guided through with a teacher or just in retreat, and then eventually the mind really begins to let go, and it learns to let go, and then sometimes it really lets go entirely and kind of unplugs, and that's seen as an experience that leaves some kind of transformation that doesn't go away.
But that letting go entirely and unplugging has a name, and it's Nirvana.
But yeah, it's a moment of seeing Nirvana clearly. Yeah.
What does that mean?
It's hard to, I hate to sound mystical and say it's hard to really put it into words. It does also mean different things in different traditions. I think it's just the mind intuitively learning that it's possible to let go of all, the technical term is all formations, which means everything we perceive, everything we think, that it's just possible to kind of unplug in a certain way. And it's not so radically different from other mind states that we enter every day, like sleep, for example. If you're constantly thinking about trying to go to sleep, you can't fall asleep. The mind learns how to let go. This is just letting go in a more profound way, in a way that enables the mind to really exhale all the time in a certain way.
But so, okay, if I'm letting go of everything, if you are letting go of everything, how are you a lawyer, rabbi, meditation teacher, gay rights activist, author, columnist for the Daily Beast? How are you so active and successful in the world if you've taught yourself to let go?
Well, because I'm still a baby at letting go. I'm just not that advanced. At most, I'm 25% of the way to the enchilada. So I almost went back into that metaphor with which pieces of the enchilada I have. But I think there's also I think it's a helpful thing to think about the concept of karma, not in some mystical sense, but just in the way that we live. So, what are the causes and conditions? My karma being born in the West to, my socioeconomic group and so on. And, so there's some desire to kind of keep doing that kind of work. Maybe after I get my Triple Crown and get the Emmy and the Oscar and the Tony or something, then I won't care as much anymore.
Yeah.
Right. But right now I still have that desire to change the world, to somehow bring about more compassion and less injustice. So those kinds of things are still there.
But if I was fully enlightened, would I not try to achieve anything?
So that's a question which luckily we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
I'm not in danger.
And I don't worry about it too much. Yeah. It also, so for example, I'll go to a different tradition. In the Hasidic tradition of Judaism, there was a concern that if you're just in the presence of the divine all the time, you won't do anything. And so the scholars call this quietism, right? So quietists, there's no reason to do anything. You're just purely bathing in the divine radiance all the time. And that does actually come up. There are concerns that the Hasidim have in the 19th century that the mystics might get too enlightened and then they wouldn't do the work of like taking care of their community, for example, which they had responsibilities to their community and to their families for that matter. So you do see that, but I think it's kind of I'll cross that bridge when I get to it.
So I know you didn't want to get too nitty-gritty about the path of insight, but can you get a little nittier and grittier in terms of how many stages are? As I understand it, there are 4 sort of big paths, right? 4 stages. And within each 4 stages, there's something like 16 mini stages?
Yeah, 16, 18, depending on how you count it. And these are just, when I was saying before, how the mind sort of intuitively learns different things kind of in a sequence. That's just the sequence. The first couple are very basic. So, for example, I think the first one or the second one is just cause and effect. It's just, okay, I get it. There's cause and effect. Things happen as cause and effect. But there's something really profound, actually, just in the cause and effect piece. So, for example, most of the time, like right now, you might be thinking of your next question, and you think that you're thinking about that question, or I'm thinking about my answer. I'm thinking about the answer. Actually, that's not happening, right? There's just cause and effect. So you've had your training, you have your curiosity, you have your genetic background, your agenda, whatever. Those are the things that's actually determining the next question. So just seeing cause and effect helps sort of loosen this delusion, a very helpful delusion, that there's a self driving the car. The car is a self-driving car. The self emerges as a phenomenon in consciousness, and most, I think, neuroscientists would sort of agree. You won't find a homunculus in the brain somewhere like where the self actually is. It's more of an emergent property of the brain. Buddha didn't have any of those concepts, of course. But you just see in cause and effect. So that, this is cause and effect, not self. This is cause and effect, not self. When I get hungry, I get hangry. Now I'm angry. Is it that I'm angry? Well, the causes for anger are present. I got hungry. Now I'm angry. It's just that very simple thing, but you see it over and over and over again. So that's an example of one of the insight knowledges, one of the very early ones, the insight into cause and effect.
But you raised there a big issue, and I know I'm trying to get you to talk about the progress of insight, and I'm going to derail us just for a second because you brought up one of the hardest things to understand about Buddhism or meditation practice. And it's also there in other traditions as well, which is that the self is an illusion. I get it intellectually, I think, but it's hard to get viscerally. So just talk a little bit more about. Because I think most of us believe that we're very real. We look in the mirror and there we are.
Yeah, sure. Our body is there, right? So there's one of the other insight knowledges is the difference between mind and body. But just, I want to grab a phrase that you just said, like you get it intellectually but not viscerally. That's the point, right? Is that it's one thing to sort of have somebody say something and you read it and you agree or disagree. It's another thing, my word for viscerally is you get it in your kishkas, right? In your guts. Like it's really there and you're like, oh yeah, that. Yeah, okay. And you just sort of see it. That's the point of practice, right? To move from one kind of knowledge to another. But it doesn't have to be, mystical or profound. I in a previous book about non-duality, in the sense that there's no difference between subject-object, I had sort of the instruction of just, imagine raising your hand. So you could decide, somebody listening or watching this podcast right now, if I say, well, go ahead and raise your hand, and they'll either do it or they won't. So let's say you do it. And then you could review what were all the factors that led to you raising the hand. All right, so I said something, but obviously wouldn't do anything I said. So maybe some curiosity or an assessment of the risk. Seems like a low-risk activity. I'll give it a shot. Obviously, all the physical processes that were there, You can make a list of 100, 200, 300 factors that caused that action to happen, and none of them will be Dan. Like there's no one that's right there that is actually, well, that was me. I decided it. Well, all these different factors and different things about you, your personality. Maybe you had an overbearing father who told you what to do all the time. And so when some schmo on a podcast says to raise your hand, you're like, no way, I'm not doing that. Okay, so there's that cause, right? Cause and effect, not self. Cause and effect, not self. There's no there. And if you look for, there's a part of the brain, the PCC, which Judd Brewer, who I'm sure will be a guest of yours at some point, studies, which kind of does the act of selfing, right? Having that perception of the self, which is very helpful because it helps you not get run over when you cross the street. All of my examples are about crossing the street because I live in New York. It's either that or meditating on the subway.
Or Mexican food.
That's right. Exactly. I see we're seeing a pattern here. And so, but that selfing process is really helpful, but it's a process. It's not a reality. It's just how we see things. Soon we'll all be gone. Right?
But I have had this debate with my mom who
That always works.
it hasn't worked. I've never won this debate, any debate.
You know what
with my
Ram
mom.
Dass said? If you think you're enlightenment, go spend some time with your parents.
My mom does not drive me crazy. What she does is make me realize how foolish some of my conclusions are sometimes, or how hasty I've been. Is that my mom is a scientist, very rigorous mind, and she's gotten interested in Buddhism as a consequence of my interest. And she's on me about this idea of no self or selflessness or emptiness. One of the things she says is, just because you can't find it doesn't mean it isn't there.
Yeah, well, people have been looking for 2,500 years, so that does suggest a certain difficulty in finding it. It's not like I just spent Sunday afternoon and was like, yeah, can't really find the self, so I guess there is none. So that's one data point, I suppose. But it's also, you can just let go of the concept if it's not helpful. But I think for me it is helpful because where there's no self, there's also that part that suffering isn't really running the show. You know, the part of it, the part of the ego that wants to run the show is the least competent part of our minds to run the show, and yet it's convinced that it is going to take care of things. It's convinced that you're doing well or doing not well, and it has all of the answers. And it's there. It's a nice function of the mind, trying to keep you safe, trying to make you happy in a certain way. It just doesn't work. There was another Hasidic rabbi in the 1960s named Mick Jagger, who pointed out that you can't always get what you want, and so that little voice that says "I will only be happy if I get what I want" is not. It's evolutionarily adaptive, right? If we didn't have that, our great ancestors who didn't do that, they probably didn't reproduce enough, right? They got eaten by a tiger or something. But now that voice just causes suffering.
Well, I mean, it doesn't just cause. I mean, sometimes it gives you good ideas, right?
Sure. No, that's right. Yeah. I'll take out the word just.
That can cause you a lot of
It
suffering.
can cause a whole lot of suffering.
And when the beauty,
at least it does for me.
Yeah, for
go
sure.
see it for yourself. But for me, that it does. And
No question.
So it would be nice
question.
to not take it quite as seriously.
Yes. So back to the path of insight. One of the stages is called dark night. Or actually, it's called fear, I think, in the traditional language. But now it's often referred to as the dark night. Basically, you freak out. Describe why you freak out and how big a deal Dark Night is. And you've gone through it, so how bad is it?
Yeah, so I would say two things. First of all, there's regular freaking out, and then there's this kind of freaking out. People freak out all the time. You can freak out when you get the wrong appetizer at the diner. It doesn't mean that you are going through the dark night of the soul, or what they're really called are the dukkha jnanas, the stages of insight that are suffering, which doesn't sound very appealing. I didn't actually see that on the mindfulness-based stress reduction website. The 10% Happier app will take you through the stages that bring suffering. Great, sign me up. So there's also just ordinary freakouts, and I'm one. I tend to be a little skeptical of the over-reliance on maps. So I think maps are really helpful, but I don't know. Who knows what any particular person, what experience they're having at any particular time. So that's the first thing I just want to say. Sometimes you just freak out. So this kind of freak out tends to happen after a big peak experience, which is known as the knowledge of the arising and passing away.
Another stage in
that's
this
one
progress.
of the
Yes.
stage 3 or 4 on the 18. So you're going along, and then you somehow just kind of get it. And I think a lot of people have had that. I certainly had that experience many, many times, where it's hard to really put into words because, again, we understand that things are arising and passing away, but you somehow get it intuitively in this profound sense, and it can be really awesome. People think they're super enlightened at that point. They've had this like big experience. There was another best-selling book about spirituality that had three words in the title that I won't name, where somebody has this huge experience, and it's awesome, and they're really happy for having that experience.
Well, you can name. I'll name Eat, Pray, Love.
And that's
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
Like that's a wonderful experience. But that's like, okay, that's like an arising and passing away experience. Like that's part of the path. It comes along. It's a thing. And then, like Jack Kornfield said, after the ecstasy, the laundry. So like you've had this like awesome experience. You thought like maybe you're some sort of super enlightened, awakened being, and then actually, the stuff hits the fan. You're not actually that awake. And so naturally, after the light, the shadow, you kind of fall into these realizations. Arising and passing away sounds kind of cool, maybe in some Yoda mystical sense, but you really it's hard to hold on to things. Like, perceptions are just rising and passing, and you get a little dissociative, and you get a little, it's a tough time. And that's why I think the people who take this path seriously are concerned that people should have a good teacher. All you really need to get through it is a good teacher and some resilience on your own. Somebody who's guiding you and is like, oh, don't worry, you're not having a nervous breakdown, you're not dissociating, you're not having like a borderline personality disorder. Here's this text from 2,000 years ago which describes exactly what's happening to you. I wouldn't say don't worry, because you're worrying. That's part of what's happening. But don't worry. You're going to be all right. Just keep doing the thing. Keep going along. Sometimes when people don't have that kind of guidance, they can get into real trouble. And so I think it's not something to be afraid of. It's just something that any competent teacher in any tradition will know is this is the kind of thing that comes up.
I remember very vividly shopping for baby gear before our son exited the womb and entered the world. And it was fun, but also really stressful. And it felt like I was learning a brand new language. Babylist helps families celebrate with the best baby registry, ideas and inspiration for how to throw a great shower, great gifts, and digital tools that keep you and everyone you love connected. Choosing products for a growing family can be confusing. At Babylist, their expert-backed advice guides you through the process of building the perfect wish list. Their shop is deliberately curated with expert-selected and real parent-tested items to make it easy to figure out what's right for you and your family. I think I can speak for my wife on this. I believe both of us would have loved to have had this available to us when we were about to become first-time parents. Start your registry today by visiting babylist.com. Are you the biggest worrier in your family or your friend group? Are you the type of person who doom scrolls compulsively? Well, stop scrolling, grab your weighted blanket and your headphones, because I might have a new podcast that could help. From Wondery, Don't Panic leans into our most absurd anxieties and diffuses them with humor and practical advice. Hosted by the anxious and overly informed comedian Anthony Atamanik, each week the show explores a worst-case scenario. Like, what do you do if you encounter a bear or a swarm of killer bees? Or you find yourself in quicksand? Each episode's Panic of the Week will make you laugh, learn, and possibly sweat profusely. Follow Don't Panic wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen ad-free on the Amazon Music or Wondery app. So you talk about this a lot in Evolving Dharma, but the practice of meditation as currently advertised, in part by people like me, is this whole idea of you can be 10% happier, or as Jon Kabat-Zinn says, you can be less stressed through mindfulness-based stress reduction. But what you're talking about here is that this practice, as originally intended, that less stress and marginal improvements in happiness are actually side effects. The real thing is going to take you through some pretty tough territory. So do we need to think about do I need to be thinking about it as an evangelist for meditation and a guy who has a meditation app? Do I need to be thinking about how there can be some really tough stages of the practice? Or does that only really happen when people do what you've done, which is go away and do months of silent meditation?
In my experience, it really only comes in intensive practice. Others might disagree, but my personal experience, the experience of my students, I'm a meditation teacher now, among other things. I lead week-long silent retreats. You don't usually get into this really deep stuff, even in a week of silence, let alone if you're meditating 20 minutes a day to feel a little bit less stressed. So I'm not actually worried about it. I think secular mindfulness is a great gateway drug for those who are interested in taking a deeper trip, but that's only some percentage of people. I think your work and the work of other people who do the kinds of stuff you do, that's alleviating suffering for millions and millions of people, right? Who are they're not trying to get big enlightenment or awakening or liberation. They're trying to be happier, and they're trying to be less angry with their spouse, or more effective with their workmates and stuff. That's true. That's not what the original teachings of the Buddha in India, 2,500 years ago were about. But it's an adaptation of them to contemporary times. And I don't think in that adaptation, you lose a lot, but one of the things that you lose is some of this hard stuff. So it's a good thing to lose. And I think you can get to an incrementally better adjusted, less stressed out place, as insert scientific studies here, without inviting in some of these deep, profound states. I don't think you also won't get to like some powerful and permanent transformation of the mind. But again, I don't think that's the goal.
So back to the progress of insight. First of all, you made me feel better there, so thank you. Back to the progress of insight.
It's just me being a skillful teacher. I was actually just totally lying. Yeah, I don't
know.
Are
a skillful teacher.
You're like giving the keys to a drunk driver, and they're all going to crash.
That's not true. Just
That's
for anybody who takes Jay too seriously.
And I'm a lawyer, so I can expressly disclaim any liability on behalf of my host.
I should say, by the way, that not only am I interested in you because I read your book, but we've been friends for a couple of years, and so that is part of why this
I
casual,
assume every
fun
guest you
conversation.
have jokes about enchiladas.
No, you're
No, it's
special
not
in that
true.
regard.
I saw that talk with the Dalai Lama, wasn't he? He was talking about enchiladas.
Mexican food did not come up in
It
that
didn't.
conversation. He did make fun of me, like you do. Anyway, you will not get me off my path here. Back to the path of insight. So after these 18 stages, there is an experience, a cessation experience that you were talking about before, an experience of nirvana. This is people are, for some reason, which I hope you will explain. This is considered taboo to discuss. You can discuss it in theory, but you're not supposed to discuss your own experiences of it. You, however, in your book, you talk about it. Why did you do that, and what was it like to have this experience of Nirvana, which is such a loaded term? It's a band from 1991, and also just like a kind of a word we use mostly flippantly. So anyway, I'll stop talking and let you talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when we use the word nirvana, we're like, oh, that must be like the best orgasm ever,
Yeah.
like the most incredible. And that's not, it's just the state of letting go. I mean, that's a lot less interesting than the greatest orgasm ever. It's just, it's what the world looks like when the mind isn't clinging to it, when it's not holding on. So, it's just, it literally kind of means like going out, extinguishing that pattern where everything I want, I really want. It's fine to want things, but that's not, we really want them. Like I gotta have it. It's that gap between perception and craving. So you can have the desire, but then not stick onto it, right? And that little gap, according again, this is in the Buddhist scriptures. That's where liberation can happen. And I think liberation is more helpful than enlightenment. Enlightenment suggests that like you get something. Liberation just means you kind of get off of something. You get off the hamster wheel.
Non-addiction.
Like when they right, yeah, I'm sure is that Mark
Joseph Goldstein.
Joseph.
Yeah. I
So,
don't have any original ideas.
Imagine,
Thank you for pointing that out, counselor.
If you imagine that you're, a hamster on the wheel, like what's the state of the hamster not on the wheel? I mean, it's still just a hamster, right? It's just not on the wheel, right? It might even go on the wheel once in a while for fun, but not because it thinks that that's the way to get ahead. So I like to sort of demystify it. That's one reason I talk about it. It's also the first of these 4 stages is pretty accessible. Anybody can do it with enough practice. All of the leading teachers in this particular tradition, the Theravada tradition, have gone through that. The leading teachers in Zen and Tibetan traditions have equivalents that they've all. So anytime you meet sort of a Zen teacher who's set up in a lineage and is teaching, they've reached at least this level of liberation.
Do they call it Kensho
or whatever the experience is, whatever and they're different maps. Not everything aligns, but whatever. They've had these kinds of experiences, so it's not as though, the Buddha didn't say this is only accessible to the rarefied few. Actually, the Buddha said it's accessible to everybody.
Yes, he did.
So that seems like an interesting pragmatic approach to this kind of meditation practice in the deep end of the pool, to use that metaphor. So that's why I talk about it. And again, I don't think that I'm claiming anything that every other teacher hasn't experienced and they have. There are 2 reasons. There are 2 reasons why it is taboo. The first is an old one. The second is a new one. There's an idea that certainly a fully enlightened being doesn't go around saying, I'm a fully enlightened being.
Except for the Buddha.
Right. So
he did. He was calling himself the Tathagata, right?
So,
the one who's gone beyond.
There's always an exception.
Right.
No, there are many people in the Pali Canon, in those original texts, who are described as arhants. They're fully enlightened. Later, eventually, the idea came along that the true arhat shouldn't say so.
An arhat, just so people know, is a
person.
fully enlightened being. Yeah.
So, and that got extended even to these lower, more mundane levels that I've gotten to and many other people have gotten to. And then second, in the contemporary sphere, you could just imagine how well this whole stages of enlightenment thing went over with a bunch of competitive Americans going over in the 1960s and 70s, right? So, we have presidential candidates who want to compare their anatomies. So that's just sort of a thing that Americans like to do. Well, I've gotten to stage 17.3 and you've only gotten to stage 17.1. And, who's got what attainment and who got to this and who did that. And, so early on in the founding of the Western traditions that that drew on these older ones, there was sort of this sense of let's tone down all the competitive stuff and let's not talk about all of this stuff. And I think that was wise. Maybe went too far to the other side about making it mystifying and weird and who knows what this is. But I think that's why it happened.
How do you know that you didn't delude yourself into thinking you had this experience, because you knew about the maps, and so you were kind of primed to want to go in this direction. So how do you know it really happened?
Well, so the funny thing is that for 3 weeks after having what this experience seems to have been,
By the way, it's called stream entry, right? That's the technical term.
That's right. So and it just means you've entered the stream of the Dharma. It's not like a big deal. Like, okay, so now you're in the gang. You've had your initiation experience.
Right. You say it's just a few steps beyond being a novice.
Yeah. I mean, it's like 2 or 3 months out from being a novice. You could unplug and you'll get it in a month, or maybe 2 months if you're a slow learner. And so
give me 3.
You take 90 days. Just so within 6 months, I think you would be able to. So that's. That's the basic idea, is that you're just kind of getting into the stream, so to speak.
But why are you convinced it was real?
Oh, right. So after I had the sort of experience, I was sure that wasn't it, because I'd read some book which said it was supposed to be something else. So actually, but I was walking around feeling sublimely happy for some unknown reason. I was like, well, I know that wasn't stream entry, but it sure did change my life. That was really awesome. That was incredible. Da 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 da. But because I had some preconceived notion, even after having the experience, I just assumed, well, I don't know. I read this book that this should happen and that should happen, and those things didn't happen. Therefore, that wasn't it. I was working with a teacher. I was in Nepal in the middle of a 5-month silent meditation jag, and he was very skilled in these maps in this particular tradition, which again I'll just say is one of many. It's not like this is the map, but he was on this set of maps, and he had me really review the experience carefully, and was there a kind of a gap in your series of perceptions, and how did that work, and could you make it happen again if you sort of like a scientific method. So it was pretty rigorous, kind of going through all that stuff. But then, the real proof is in the pudding. I mean, it was one of those kind of before and after experiences. And again, I've had like awesome spiritual experiences now for 20 odd years. So it's not like I'm not familiar with the idea of, having an awesome experience. This did seem really qualitatively different. And it's just very accessible. One of my favorite practices in daily life is just to kind of touch back to that place of non-seeking, non-desiring mind. It's always accessible. It's right there. Just got into it now. Isn't that great? It's worth it.
You just did it right now.
Yeah, sure.
And yet you are, I know you are a really ambitious guy. And so how do these two things work together?
I mean, there's two answers: the truth, and then the sort of mystical BS that I'll give you.
Okay.
So the truth
You're
is,
gonna tell me which is which.
Yeah,
okay.
The truth is that again, I'm just early on the path, and I'm still fully captive by the same forces of greed, hatred, and delusion as everyone else. Even if I'm 25% of the way there, that means I'm 75% not there. So that's the truth. The mystical BS line that I could give you is, you can be in the world but not be totally of the world, right? You can sort of want something but not feel as though your life is a mess if you don't get it. And so it's possible to kind of see through these phenomena, and still love everything about them. Love great experiences, be really upset about injustice, and want to work toward, and violence and all of those kinds of things. And so I'm calling it mystical BS because that's actually the truth, but I want to sort of hide it in the language of mystical BS so you don't think that I'm really arrogant.
I know you also well enough to know that you're not really arrogant. And here I'm going to ask a question that proves that, which is you wrote another book, which I was able to read parts of, but not the whole thing. It's called The Gate of Tears, and it's beautifully written. And one of the things, it's all about the fact that even though you've had these amazing experiences, life is hard. And you lost your mother. I met your mother. She was a wonderful, wonderful human being, and it was very painful for you, justifiably. And just because you're a stream enterer didn't make it not suck uncontrollably. So talk a little bit about that. It seems like you can get pretty far in meditation, but it doesn't end pain and suffering.
And I don't think we would want it to, though, right? That's part of what's in the Gate of Tears. Like, I don't think we'd want to have this existence in which we don't feel pain at the loss of our parent. I mean, right? I wouldn't want to live that way. That's what I meant before when I was talking about karma. Like, maybe it would be better to just not be affected by anything, but it's not an aspiration of mine. And I don't really know people who are like that, who are just totally colorless and bland. Those aren't my role models. My role models are people who really are engaged in the world and in relationships with others, with their family members. So, yeah, I mean, the Gate of Tears really actually is about embracing that full range of human experience as part of what it is to be alive. And it's possible to, and this is a little hard to communicate for non-meditators, but even just in the beginning of mindfulness, we can see that it's possible to coexist with difficult feelings without being taken over by them. So people would ask me, shortly after my mom died, how are you doing? And I'd say, I'm doing really badly. That's fine. Right. And
That's fine.
Yeah, it is. And it was fine. First of all, it felt good to feel bad because it was coming from love. But what am I supposed to be feeling? Right. Yeah. It feels terrible. Like it was really rough. And that's fine. That's what it should be. And it's possible, again, to have just a slightly different relationship, as if we're settled back a little bit, or as if there's, one metaphor is like you can be the sky instead of the storm, and just sort of be present with all these things that happen, the joys, the sorrows, everything else, in a way that actually makes them quite profound. It just makes it like another season of the year, really beautiful in its own way, and a way that we can relate to one another if we're able to be authentic with one another and emotionally authentic. And that, to me, is the other enchilada. That's really the part about being in authentic relationship, both with people I know and with people I don't know. A lot of my politics comes from an attempt to be empathetic toward the other and not say the others are, the rapists and murderers, or the others are the threat that we can't do anything about. That there's something, I think, really profound about not falling into that othering capacity that we all have.
You may have just answered the question, but I was going to ask you before, what is the difference in your life pre and post stream entry? And did you just answer it, or are there other things to say?
I would say the main thing is to ask my friends. And since you can't do that, people who knew me before and after, it's just a whole different thing, and just the level of, so, I think all of us who are involved in fields where we're trying to compete and get ahead, there's that voice that says you suck and you're inadequate and whatever. So that voice comes along. And it's like, oh, there's that voice. Well, that's a stupid voice, right? Just, and it's not even stupid as too much like pushing it away. It's like, okay, there's that voice that was installed early by my well-meaning Jewish parents who gave me love when I got 100 and asked me what I got wrong when I got a 98. Right? Okay, so that's like installed, like probably not getting out for for the rest of my life, but it doesn't mean I like really believe it. So that's just one example. I really did believe it a lot beforehand. It was before and after transformation. It's coincidentally too, I came back. I was on that retreat during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And I sort of came back and the world had lost its mind. Yeah. And it was really interesting because I thought I was pretty weird. I grew a long beard and I was hanging out with monks and like, pretty much a weirdo. Right. And then I came back and the whole world was like the weirdo world. And it actually really reinforced the idea that there were different lines and axes of truth. And I'm still a greed type. I just want all of them.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I know you've got to run soon. When you describe stream entry, and I sit here even though I have no idea whether it's real, but I sit here with somebody I like and trust and respect, and you're describing this experience, and so I'm inclined to believe you're not lying to me or deluded. And so I want it. But how do I get it I got a kid, I got a full-time job, I write books, I host a game show, I give speeches.
Well, let go of the game show. That's step one.
Well, that only takes like a week. So anyway, the long way of saying I have a lot of things to do. How could I possibly attain what you have?
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is, this is not the popular answer, but the truth is these were monastic practices. They were for monks and nuns, and you can't actually have it all. And it may just be that your karma with your causes and conditions with your family, your job, your profession, maybe not. There are teachers who say that you can get to these levels in daily life with a certain kind of intensive practice. I didn't do that. For me, it was easier to unplug and go away for a while. But there are people who say you can do it. But, look, your point about, you're saying this thing and you seem reasonable. You can replicate that 100 times. Joseph Goldstein's gotten way more than first of these four paths.
Again, he's my meditation teacher.
He may not say how many he's gotten, but it's definitely more than one.
He says between 1 and 3.
Yeah, right. So that's there are a lot of people who seem pretty reasonable, and yet who have had these transformations. And again, I want to get
I
away
can't
from
tell if it's like the real deal or like some elaborate affinity scam that I'm like falling into.
Well, it depends how much of a check you wrote to him. I don't know, how much you donated to that Ponzi scheme up there in Massachusetts. Just kidding. So I think that's key, right? That's why if you look actually again, let's flash back to some of the scriptures from 2,500 years ago. What are the factors that lead to awakening? One of the ones that appears over and over and over again is called noble friends and acquaintances. So noble friends and conversations. So and what they mean by noble isn't like knights and dukes, but people who have done practice, who you can relate to, and having conversations with them and finding out what it's like for them in lived experience. But no, I think it is possible. Look, it's not always possible to unplug for a month, but sometimes it is. I was very fortunate in 2008. It's 2007. I ended a relationship. I was at a nice job transition point. I was very fortunate at that point that I could really decide this is really something I want to try to do. And I was fortunate that the right books and stuff came along, and I'd heard about these paths in practice, and so I went for it. And at some point, the circumstances align, or maybe it's true. Maybe it can be attained in daily life, but with very intensive practice. Again, for me, that's not my path. It's just I'm too entranced by all the stuff that keeps us busy all the time to really devote to practice while I'm in the world. So.
Well, what I've tried to do, and I don't know if this will be enough, and obviously everybody's kind of mental situation is different. The Buddhist term would be everybody's paramis are different. But so I have committed to doing 2 hours a day of practice, and
that's a lot more than I do, by the way. Just so you should know, which is great.
Yeah,
you go, girl. That's what I'm trying to say.
Hard.
That's a huge commitment. I have no idea how you do it.
It's been hard. Also, this whole thing about having good friends and good in a very specific way. I've worked very hard to cultivate that. I've committed with my wife's permission and collusion to go on at least one long retreat a year. And so I'm trying to do the best I can to create the conditions that would allow these experiences to arise. I don't know if it'll happen, but that's what I'm doing. It's
also setting intention too, and having that right intention is again part of the path. Having just set the intention, even that is again it's 1/8 of the work right there. And so having that intention to cultivate those things. And again, I think the challenge for people like you and me who tend to be a little ambitious and in the world is ultimately at the end of the day, you really have to, it's almost cruel. You just totally have to let go of it. And you can't fake it either. You can't sit there and be like, I have let go of the desire for liberation. I don't really care. I don't really care, because you're full of it, right? It's not true if you still do. So I literally at some point on that retreat in Nepal just got to the point where I truly didn't care, and I was just like, well, okay, whatever. And it's so boring, sitting there for hours. I was doing 3-hour sits, right? Because when you're on retreat, you get really concentrated. You can sit for a long time. It's not painful. And, that's a lot of time, like 4 3-hour sits a day. It's just like a lot of time. That's intensive practice, right? That's really devoting, you think about what it takes to become like a really good musician or a really good athlete or something like that. I can't imagine, I read about these athletes who are, they're training 10 hours a day or whatever. It's just mind boggling. So this is pretty similar. Mm-hmm. And to get to that level, that's what it does seem to require. Maybe not, but in my experience, it does. Until you actually really are no longer needing it. And then it shows up. It's really quite perverse.
It is perverse. So one of the things you talk about that you really document very well in Evolving Dharma is you talked about how there is this justified taboo, I guess, among the sort of current hierarchy of meditation teachers in this country against talking about the map, against about a taboo against saying where you are and where your students are and all that stuff on the path of insight. But in reaction to that, there has grown up this school, and you're actually kind of part of it, of pragmatic or hardcore meditators or Dharma practitioners. So just tell me a little bit about who are these people, and what do you think about it?
Well, it's like 5 guys in a room. I mean, it's not a lot of people, right? So first of all, most people do not care. And I think it's always good to keep a reality check, right? So most people don't care, but the overwhelming majority of people don't care about meditation. And the overwhelming people who care about meditation are doing stress reduction and other things which help them lead more productive and more happy lives. So we're already, the people who are or the entire universe we're talking to is like a very small group. And then now you've just identified the even smaller micro reactant to that micro small group. So we're talking like a few folks on a bulletin board, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
now I think there's really interesting things happening in that community, and a re-embrace of some of these maps. And so, there are people who really practice in this way, in a very sort of strict way. The person who I went to study with was actually not part of that movement. As a traditional monk. He was German born, but had lived in Burma for 30 odd years. And I just felt, for me, I liked the sense of rootedness that came from really going to a traditional source. It felt really good to me. It felt really grounded, and not kind of wavy and in the air. But wavy in the air can be fun too. And there are now online communities that are doing really interesting work and kind of charting where people are going. Of course, in any small group, then with this person versus that person, and it gets, even though everybody's enlightened, they're still biting each other's heads off.
Mm-hmm.
So, that comes with the territory, it seems. But it is interesting that there is kind of this group of meditation hobbyists who are geeking out about meditation the same way you might geek out about Game of Thrones, and getting really into it, and making progress. I mean, I think Game of Thrones also makes you a wiser person, but this really does, and that's what's really powerful about it.
Final question, and seriously, I really could talk to you for a long, long time. But final question: do you raise the possibility in your book? And again, I just want to emphasize here that especially for people who are listening, that you are not some wild-eyed guru. You are a guy in a blazer who is a lawyer, also a columnist. And so you make this claim. I want to say that before I talk about the claim that you've made, which is that you think it's possible that maybe the Dharma, Buddhism, could save the world. How could you say that, and what do you mean by it? Why do you believe that?
Yeah, so, again, we're in a political moment in our country where you don't have to be some sort of Buddhist sage to see the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion really active among lots and lots and lots of people. And so I don't think it's like a radical, weird thing to say, what would it look like if we actually, people actually worked on those parts of ourselves? Like, this is just part of who we are as human beings. It's not like some weird phenomenon, in this part of the 21st century. Greed, hatred, and delusion is part of what it is, not even to just be a human, even a lot of animals, right? So this is just part of who we are. And it does seem to me that one of the things that could lead to a kind of safer and less destructive world would be working on our internal stuff, and then replicating that on a macro level. And that's one reason I'm a big fan of popular mindfulness, right? I mean, just to go to a single store and have a desire to buy something, and then feel like, oh, I don't need to listen to that desire. Okay, there's that desire. Oh, yeah, that. Okay, I know it. On to the next thing. Just that, multiplied by however many people do it, it could have a profound impact. Let alone, wow, I read about this story and there's crime and I feel really afraid, and I have what do I do with that fear? Oh, I'm not afraid. I'm going to be really strong, and I'm going to, I want a really strong leader who's going to take care of the bad guys for me. Or I could say, wow, I might be really afraid. Well, that's interesting. Maybe I won't listen to that either. It's just that difference, I think, actually, again, multiplied by the 5 billion people in the world, I think makes a real impact. And I don't think it's the Dharma in the narrow sense. I don't think everybody's going to become Buddhist, and I don't think, not at all. But I do think that as more and more people can just personally feel the benefits of some kind of contemplative practice. It could be a prayer practice in their church, or if they're spiritual but not religious, it could be it could be a yoga practice, whatever it is. As more and more people, I think, just feel that, wow, this kind of works for me, and here's why, and I can articulate why, and I'm not signing up for something stupid or something, that requires me to sacrifice my intellectual credibility. Just if that actually keeps happening, that could have a real impact. And I think it is kind of the ultimate think globally, act locally approach. And it doesn't mean, I'm out there every day working on top-down, law stuff, religion stuff for my writing and my other work. So it's not like that. It's not like it's either or. But ultimately, there's something about human nature that can be evolved and made more wise and compassionate.
It's very gratifying after 3 years of having occasional lunches with you and reading your books, to see my friends sit here and deal with my pain in the butt questions and give such clear, cogent, and compelling answers gives me a lot of naches, as you would say in the Jewish tradition. So bravo. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm experiencing a lot of mudita, sympathetic joy, as we would say in the Buddhist tradition, for you.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
And some envy also.
So that was Jay Michaelson. I hope he was as fascinating as advertised. He said at one point that nobody cares about this hardcore or pragmatic Dharma scene, but I actually think while these folks aren't getting a lot of attention right now, they probably will be, and maybe I'll be the reason for that, because they are fascinating. What they're doing to their minds and their brains and to their lives is totally fascinating. There's a lot to be learned. And in coming episodes, we're going to have these people on, and you'll get to hear from them. Again, these are people who believe they have gone way down the path or progress of insight, and you'll get to hear and make judgments for yourself. Again, I'm going to do my little thing of asking you kindly, if you like the podcast, please subscribe, rate it, give us a review, and we'll be back with a freshie next week. Thanks. Hey, Prime members. You can listen to 10% Happier early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. Or you can listen early and ad-free with Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts. Before you go, do us a solid and tell us all about yourself by completing a short survey at Wondery.com/survey.